Here on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's a place, this place here, which is what the word Eora means, has been a place where people have gathered, have come together, have come to tell stories, to celebrate, to mourn, to exchange ideas for more time than we can possibly imagine. And when we come together to tell our stories or complain about our contracts or hear from the perspectives of artists and others, we honour their stories and also pay respects to elders past and present. I'm Esther Anatolitis, I'm Executive Director of NAVA, and we have got, can I just say, a very exciting evening planned, looking at the fine print, because as some of us were saying earlier, sometimes we only touch on these things or think about these things or really start to investigate these things when things go wrong. And we were also saying, some of us earlier, that frustratingly or disappointingly, if those of us who've been through art school, it's not necessarily part of the professional practice component or focus to go through some of this stuff in detail. So we're going to look at some of this stuff in some detail. We're going to hear from a couple of artists and an expert, and then we're going to have a good conversation together and actually answer some questions. And we're also going to benefit from the expert advice and resources of the Art Law Centre of Australia, represented by Suzanne Derry. So first of all, big welcome to Suzanne.
Thanks very much.
Then sitting next to her, Kelly Doley is an artist and a curator with an intersectional feminist ethic. Please welcome Kelly. And then another artist whose politics I admire, Shahmen Suku, is a performance artist, a drag queen, and numerous other things, I reckon. Please welcome Shahmen. So the plan for tonight is I'm going to talk a bit about our organisation, about NAVA, about what we do in particular around industry standards, through the Code of Practice. How do we actually set and how do we more and more effectively enforce the kinds of standards that mean that artists can confidently go into negotiation situations and already find the balance tipped in their favour. Then Suzanne Derry is going to discuss their really great artist contract checklist and some consideration for artists before signing a contract, because that, of course, can be one of the freakiest, most nerve-wracking times. And then once we've, set that exciting and completely non-intimidating scene, we're going to hear from artists. We're going to hear from Kelly talking about some of her experiences and challenges as an artist and some advice for emerging artists. And then Shahmen looking at his experience with contracts, what's gone wrong, what he's learned. And he did point out to me earlier, and I can see now he's actually got a contract, like live in the flesh right there with him. So we've got everything we need to have a good conversation. So we're going to talk for probably less than an hour altogether, because we want to leave good time for questions. And as you think of one, scribble it down so you don't forget it. And please don't imagine that any question is, too silly or too naive, because this is a, complicated area, and it's something that at no matter what age or career level, as artists, as creative people, we find ourselves in new situations, new contracting and legal situations all the time. Let's go through your questions, absolutely. All right, so first of all, NAVA is the National Association for the Visual Arts, and our role is to do everything we can to make sure that artistic courage ignites the Australian culture, that artists have the skills, the confidence, the networks, the ambitious and fair sector behind them to make really great work, and in doing so, to make an Australia that is also ethical and courageous. And we do that in lots of different ways. Obviously, you'll be aware of our membership program, and there's some information up the back. We won't go into that, into too much detail about that. And of course, you'll be aware of our professional development program, because here you are and here it is. And that's incredibly important, that we keep not just presenting artists to share those experiences, but also experts to skill us all up and raise the bar. And then, of course, the core thing that NAVA's work is about is the Code of Practice for the professional arts, crafts and design sector. And that is the handbook, the Bible, the yardstick, the best practice standards across a whole lot of different areas of professional practice, from exhibiting and commissioning and working in public spaces, working with galleries and contracts, intellectual property and so on. It's as much as a resource and a referral to other places as it is the standards and the policies that a whole bunch of sector organisations for decades have come together and agreed upon. It also includes the fees and payments schedule, which we update more regularly in the code. We're about to embark on a really massive update of the entire Code of Practice, and that's going to involve academic partners and creative and legal partners, and you'll hear a lot more about that at Future Forward, which is happening on August 14-15 in Canberra. But it's something that, alongside the updating of the code, we also need to work really hard to build and sustain the commitments, the relationships with sector organisations that will actually implement the code and make that the enforceable standard, so that, again, we have hopefully fewer and fewer of those situations where we're hearing, and arts law are hearing, many similar frustrations from artists over legal and other conflicts and disputes that are so easily avoidable. And so it's our role to make sure that institutions are aware of their responsibilities, and that we've actually come together as a sector to agree on what those standards of professional practice are. So that is part of what we do. In championing the code, in championing the work of artists, we also, of course, do a lot of very, very public advocacy work. And that's about nurturing a really good, exciting, informed, relevant, and again, very visible public conversation about the value of the arts, about what it means to practice as an artist in Australia, about how the arts and artistic practice connect in with other areas of policy, for example, other key areas of decision-making for government, and then all the things that make up the culture that we want to be proud of as Australians. So we do that through things like submissions to inquiries and lots of meetings and stuff around the country, but also through public campaigns around fair pay for artists, around gender equity, around the full spectrum of things that it means to be a practicing professional artist in Australia today. We've been around for around 30 or possibly more years, and so has the Arts Law Centre of Australia. You may know that they're our neighbours. We are both in this building downstairs. Over to Suzanne now to talk to us a bit about arts law in general and the contract checklist.
Thank you for coming, everybody. I think that it's really, everybody knows that understanding what a contract is and how it can affect your interest as a visual artist is important. But taking the next step of actually then attending a talk like tonight's talk or talking to a lawyer is something that is often, I think, quite confronting and can be quite a challenge for people. So thanks for coming, and I promise that this legal component of tonight is not going to be scary or anything. I will preface what I'm about to say by explaining that arts law delivers legal education in the same way that NAVA delivers professional development all around the country, and the talks that we deliver on contracts usually run for about 2 hours. So you're not going to leave today or tonight being a contract law specialist, and I probably wouldn't want to do that to you, but it'll just give you a bit of an identification of some of the red flags for things to look out for. You'll see on your seats that you've got some information sheets, which are essentially just a little checklist of things to look out for when you're looking at your visual arts contract. Now, I'm very aware that visual artists sign all sorts of different agreements in the course of their practice. So you might be signing a copyright license, you might be signing a commissioning agreement, you might be co-creating with somebody else and wanting to have an arrangement to work with that person. And so this checklist is to be really used as a general guide, but I would invite everybody here and anybody who is subsequently watching this footage to seek legal advice when you are looking at a contract, because talking to people in the industry is a good thing to do. Asking people, have you worked with this person before? What do you know about them? Is there anything I should look out for? That's a great thing to do. But seeking advice from a lawyer who has a detailed understanding of the issues like copyright and moral rights in the visual arts sector is really a valuable thing to do. And arts law can help you with that. So if you ever are in a position of needing to get some advice, please get in touch with us. Rather than reading through the checklist, because I'm going to presume that everybody here can do that for themselves, I thought it might be helpful to just outline some really kind of top view things to think about when you are contracting as a visual artist. And then if there are specific questions that people have got after we've all presented, then they can raise those. And forgive me if some of these things sound obvious at the outset. I've worked at arts law for 10 years now, and about 35% of the clients that we advise are visual artists. So there are some continuing themes that come up day in, day out for the visual artists that we talk to, and some take-homes that I thought might be helpful. So the first thing is, it's really important that if somebody gives you a contract that they ask you to sign, that you read that agreement. And I know that that sounds super obvious, but often these contracts are not written in a particularly reader-friendly way. And often the signature of the contract or the execution of the contract is wrapped up in your receipt of that advance payment that you're waiting on, that's going to put food on your table that week or weekend. So when somebody says to you, sign this agreement and then we can release the first payment, and you sort of, well, let's get this going, just before you put your signature on that piece of paper, stop and read the document. Don't ever assume that what is written in that agreement is actually known and understood by the other person who's given it to you. So you're having a conversation, Kelly, I think you and I were talking about this, or it might have been you, Penelope, where there's often an assumption by artists who get given a contract by somebody else, like a business or a government agency, that is the standard contract, and everybody in the known universe, other than you, the artist receiving that contract, understands exactly what it all means, and you should just sign it, otherwise you'll look silly if you ask questions. That is absolutely not the case. So I know for a fact, having looked at a lot of these agreements, that often the agreement that you get given by this other person or business is in fact the template that was drafted for them 5 years ago when they engaged a plumber. And it's then been sort of tinkered with so that it looks like it's an arts contract, but it's got all of these strange kind of things that it's inherited from its, from its origins that just don't work for you as a visual artist. So reading the contract is really, really important. The second thing about contracts that you should know is that contracts can be made verbally, So a contract doesn't actually have to be in writing in order for it to be enforceable. And the reason you've got to be really careful about this is that often in the creative sectors, including the visual arts sector, people have lots of conversations before a project happens. There are lots of those sort of initial, your work's really fantastic, we're really interested in talking to you sorts of conversations. And then there are often the more intimate, come in for a meeting, let's have a discussion about your ideas. And then there might be a more developed, could you provide us with a written proposal of some kind, with some costing? And then working towards what you as the visual artist often expect is some ultimate document that comes out of that. Now, often what happens in our experience is that the processes of the people who are contracting you don't necessarily include having a written document that they provide to you to sum up all of those conversations. So I think it's very valuable if you are going to engage in conversations about doing work for or with somebody else, to at some point in that initial phase of let's have a chat about this, what does this look like, what could we do with you, what could you do with us, asking the question, just checking, do you guys have a contract that I should be expecting to, look out for in my inbox? Or would you like me to put together some points that just summarise what we're talking about here? Because, and I'm sort of making up a number here, but I'd say that at least sort of 80% of the disputes that we provide advice on at Arts Law to visual artists, there has been no written document that sums up the agreement, and the agreement has been made out of a combination of conversations, things that you thought the other person was saying when they said X, what you understood they actually meant. And the reason that that's problematic is that as human beings, we are all individual and unique in the way that we communicate and understand the world. So when I say to you, we'd really love to use your work for our launch, you might understand one thing and I might understand something else. So having something in writing. Now, Arts Law has got a huge suite of template agreements that visual artists can use. They are not free, you pay a fee for them, but they are an excellent benchmark and guide for you when you are negotiating any kind of contract with somebody else, so that you don't have to go off and get a law degree before you can actually put things in writing. There's a template contract that you can access. We've got one for copyright licensing, one for commissioning of public and private art. We've got one for venue hire. We've got one for working with a gallery and those sort of agency agreements. So it's really important to, I suppose, appreciate and understand what the value of having something in writing is, which is that it protects you so that if the wheels fall off, and the wheels do sometimes fall off even when you have got a written agreement, there is something to go back to that you can rely on as proving your understanding of what you were originally agreeing to, so that you aren't stuck in a situation where you're saying, like some of the artists that we unfortunately have to assist in very difficult negotiations. Our assistance of them is not unfortunate to us. Their situation is unfortunate to us in that they have not had a contract which clearly outlines what their rights and responsibilities are, and sometimes they've had no contract at all, and that's left them vulnerable to other people saying, oh, well, we thought that when you said that we could use the work for that, you actually meant every time we do this project, and we do it every year. So the fee we paid you is the fee you get. And then we're in the difficult position of having to try to backpedal and imply terms from previous conversations. So it's really good to get things clear and in writing. And if you don't know how to do that, call us so we can give you some advice about some of the key terms that go into those agreements. Which brings me to the next point about getting advice. Now, as a lawyer, of course I'm going to say always get legal advice. it is so, I want to use the word heartbreaking, but that's probably a very sentimental word for a lawyer to use. It's so concerning to us when we have artists who ring us who have been presented with written agreements. So they've had the opportunity to review, but have signed those agreements before they've got advice. And by signing those agreements, often what they've done is they've committed to something that they never intended to commit to, something that they didn't know they were agreeing to. And an example of that is an artist who signed a contract believing that what they were doing was giving a permission, a limited permission, for their work to be used for a particular purpose. The work was to be reproduced in print. But what the fine print of that contract actually said was that they were assigning their copyright in that work. Now, what that means is you are giving your copyright away forever and ever. It is not yours to use anymore, to the other person or the other business. And once you've signed a contract like that in Australia, there is a presumption that you, as a knowing, consenting adult, have agreed to that thing. It doesn't matter whether or not you read it. So if you're going to put your signature on something, make sure you've read it and got some advice. So the other side of getting advice is, of course, talking to peak bodies like NAVA, making sure that you're having some conversations, going and having a look at the Code of Practice and comparing the agreement that's been given to you with some advice of people who know the industry well, because often you might be involved in being asked to sign a contract where you actually are not sure what the rate should be. So it's not just about getting the words right, but it's about also getting things like the money right and the payment schedule right. You know, hey, arts law, does it make sense that I'm being paid 95% of the fee on delivery? Is that okay? And I'd probably be saying to you, I don't know which kind of contract it is that's asking for that, but I'd probably be saying to you, what kind of costs have you got up front? And should you be pushing for a much greater upfront portion of what you're getting paid ultimately? Because, you know, if the horse bolts and something happens towards the end of the project, I don't want you stuck with 5% of that fee in your pocket and that's it. So having those sorts of conversations, looking at that code of practice and asking NAVA questions around what is industry standard. So NAVA cannot provide legal advice because they are not lawyers, but they can be incredibly helpful in terms of providing you with that industry guidance around what the benchmark that code of practice sets for you as a visual artist. The next point that I just wanted to make, and I'm relying on someone else shutting me up at some point if I need to, Laura, I'm looking at you, is don't be afraid to negotiate or say no. So this is not just about the confidence to walk away from a deal that is a bad deal for you. And I'll give you an example. Last week, I was looking at a contract for an artist where, when we took our calculators out and we did the sums, their ability to make the money that this project was going to cost them back was sort of pretty minuscule. So, in other words, we formed the view that this was going to cost them quite a lot of money to do this project. So reading the contract, getting the advice, followed those steps. But then having that difficult conversation with the artist, what, if not money, does this project give you that you really want? So if we can't negotiate this fee because they've told us we're not moving on the fee, that's it, what else about this contract makes you want to sign it or makes you not want to sign it? And if it's a bad deal for you, being able to say, actually, I can't agree to this. You know, as a visual artist who values what I do in my industry, I cannot consent to an agreement which I know is going to end up with me in the red. I can't do that.
Just 1 or 2 more minutes, Suzanne.
Excellent. So don't be afraid to negotiate either. Because things are written down in black and white and presented to you, it does not mean that they are a standard you have to agree to. Once you've got that advice, it is absolutely normal within all creative sectors, once people have read their contracts, to write to the other person and say, I've read this, I'm not that comfortable with clause 2, can we change it so that it doesn't say that I give you my copyright, can it just be a license? We can give you some advice about how to do that. And the very last point, given I have 2 minutes, is ask around and do your homework. Ask other people who've worked with the person or business that's contracting you and get to know them. It's kind of like dating. You know, you need to know what you're getting into and who you're dealing with. So on that point, I'll leave it there.
I mean, I think that very first point about actually reading it is, and it's not just something that, you know, we do in a hurry as artists. I can think of many organisations that I've had to have similar conversations with, and certainly that important advice about asking questions, that it's not set in stone, that it is very often something that has gone through, you know, it's like a corexki, you know, it's a thing that's gone through all these iterations of cut and pastes and so on. I can think of one really chilling example of a state government putting out a whole lot of standard contracts to funded organisations because the entirety of that government was introducing one standard contract for every single organisation that they get into a contract with. And so, of course, those in the arts had a very good look, and exactly as Suzanne was saying, there's a cause about assigning certain kinds of copyright, which would have been completely outrageous to every artist that every organisation dealt with. And of course, we, you know, got back to them. And the first thing was, oh, but this is the standard contract, you know, as though it had landed from the sky and could not possibly be changed. So, of course, you know, we all got together and proposed an alternative and then had some good conversations with the Arts Ministry of that government. And the thing was ultimately changed. But it could have been very easy to feel either intimidated or that, you know, there was no other possible alternative. But the conversation absolutely has to be had. So here are two artists who have had those conversations or who've experienced the pitfalls. Let's hear from Kelly first. What are some good stories? What are some doozies? What should artists know from your experience?
Well, when I first got invited onto this panel, I said I'm a terrible addition because I've been terrible at this. I think I'm in my 12th year of being a professional practicing artist, and I only really knew about some of the stuff that you were just talking about until last year. So,
well, you're not alone in that. You're absolutely not alone in that.
Yeah. And actually, most of the stuff that I learnt was because, and this is a blatant pitch, was that NAVA ran a short course on contracts, and I did it, and I was like, oh, okay. Like even stuff like I didn't even know what moral rights was or anything like that because no one teaches you that. So that was like incredibly useful. But the main thing that I took away from doing that course was, which I just did last year, was that you can actually negotiate that stuff. I think particularly when you're an emerging artist, it's so nerve-wracking to be given a contract from an organisation that maybe you've always dreamed of showing at, and you're given this piece of paper and everything's always very time constrained, you know, like you get the contract and then they're like, you have to sign this tomorrow because we're behind anyway, and there's all this time pressure on it. To actually know that you can actually talk about the terms of that contract, I had no idea. So it's been really good to know that, so thank you. And like, I'll tell this example of now knowing that was, I was in a show last year and they wanted to do some merchandise as part of their exhibition. And it was like t-shirts and bags and stuff. And I just got sent the contract, and because I knew to read it, which I wouldn't normally do, I would just look for the fee and then sign and be like, yeah, let's get this going. I looked at the fee, and the fee was like a flat fee. And I was like, but shouldn't it be like if they're making a profit on every time they sell something, shouldn't I be getting a cut? And I was like, I don't know, because I'd never done merchandise before. So I went onto the Copyright Council, just to get a sense of rates, and they were saying you either get a cut of the profit or you get a little bit of every time it's sold. So total profit or a bit of every time. And I was like, oh. So I did my math, and it worked out to like way more than what they said as a flat fee. And also I noticed in it that it said that's like, we'll pay you that fee, but it didn't say if we want to print it again and again and again, we'll pay you the fee every time, if that makes sense, because it was like a limited edition run. So I was like, oh no. I was like, I didn't really feel comfortable just, I don't know, it's weird. It's like a weird artist confidence thing. Like, we're artists in the room, like, I don't know, you kind of inherit this culture of like, you should be happy with what you get, and if you're not getting paid properly, you should be happy to get the opportunity because it's promotion. And that's totally some weird thing, even though you can challenge it again and again, it's like, yeah, it's just in you or something. Anyway, so I talked to some people. I went and saw my mate who'd done some other merch and got some advice, like, what'd you get? And he was like, well, it's different, but I got this. And so we like passed notes around, and then I luckily have a mentor, and I went to my mentor and I said, this is the issue, what do you think? I think this is the right fee. And she was like, absolutely. No, you are not going into that without this fee and stating this. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to ask for this fee. And I was like writing the email, and I was so nervous, and I was like, this is what I'm asking for, like this kind of thing. Because she said, she said, you should just be going for that. Like if you tell them the right fee and then they come back to you, and it's just like, they can't have your work. Like, that's their loss. Like, this idea that, oh, I'll just put up with it. Like, they just don't get my work. So, and I was like, right, okay. So I sent this email, I was really nervous. And then they wrote back, I'm like, yeah, they just agreed. Like, they were like, oh, of course. Oh, we didn't realise, or whatever. Yeah, we'll pay you that fee, and we'll add in that thing. Every time we want to do a new edition, we'll pay you that fee again. And so then we went from there. So, yeah, I think I just thought that was a good example of, like, kind of, even still in my 11th year of practice, still really struggling to negotiate the terms of a contract, absolutely. And I think, what else did I have here? Yeah, I think I've said everything I wanted to say, which was mainly just like, I think just that culture of maybe if as artists we could get more confident, I think that would be great. And I think if this knowledge was more readily available, that would be great, because I hadn't come across it a lot, I have to be honest. And there's this thing with like, oh, if I get legal advice, that's really expensive. So like, it's a barrier in your own mind. But I wonder as well, so if more artists band together and like start actually going like, no, like that, that's good. But I wonder as well if there's a role of the organisation here in some capacity, particularly if organisations are dealing with younger artists, be aware of that power dynamic a bit. And like, why isn't it that no organisation was like, hey, you're starting out, look, I've done this a million times, this is a contract, read it, get back to us. If you've got any comments, like, let's have a chat about it. I've never had that conversation. Probably because organisations don't really want to have that conversation. Just putting it out there. I don't know. I'm generalising, but I just wonder if, it could be actually kind of on the organisation's behalf who's actually contracting, as well as the artist always having to do that work. I just wonder if that would shift things, particularly with like the really, really big institutions. You know who I'm talking about. That's my provocation.
100%. I mean, my goodness, you know, so much of what Kelly just mentioned, and also taking it back to what Suzanne was saying, that yes, this stuff is about the law, but then it's also about the professional culture. It's about the mindset, the confidence, I mean, as Kelly was just saying, there's, that instinct that you feel when something, is or isn't right, and then that kind of welling up of, oh, am I going to ask? Am I going to, every time you do that, it strengthens you and your practice and, your general capacity to just be awesome in general. But then also, it contributes to the overall culture. It makes it easier for the next person and the next person, because it doesn't set that standard for that institution to go, so that person accepted it and therefore the next person will too. But you're absolutely right that it, it's not a level kind of playing field when you look at the power dynamic or the power, the power relation between an individual artist and an institution. And it's absolutely up to that institution to uphold the very best of ethical practice. And so that's, that's up to all of us to kind of, push back on that and explain in, the clearest terms that this is something that affects, your livelihood as an artist, that organisation's reputation, that organisation's reason for being, which is, of course, to create, the kind of world where artists can show great work, and by showing great work and being paid appropriately, recognised appropriately, can sustain careers. So yeah, that is exceptionally, exceptionally important. Thanks for sharing those examples. Really, really good ones. Shamen's also got some good ones, and he's got a contract. I wonder how much detail he's going to go into. Go, read it out. Let's hear from Shahmen, and then we will start to ask some good questions.
Right. Hi everyone, I'm Shahmen. I'm also known as Rada Labia, my alter ego. So I'm a performance artist, but also a drag queen. And only just recently, I guess, started to sign contracts and doing shows in art galleries as an artist. I still do shows in pubs and festivals and other venues. So I guess I've got a different experience, I guess. There's lots of verbal agreements with pubs and venues. And then there's the written contracts with art galleries. And I've also been recently receiving sort of draft contracts that I have to then read or edit and then approve, and then and then there's the approved final contract, which I think it's a great way of, I guess I just automatically understood that it's negotiable and I can change things on there.
Every contract you get sent is a draft contract,
right,
until you sign it.
Okay, but this one has like a draft written across it, watermark. That's right. So yeah, I've got different experiences. I guess there's a lot of trust involved in a lot of the work that I do. But I mean, this is not related to the art, like an art contract, but I recently been through a tribunal case with an ex-landlord to get my bond back, and that was a tedious process, but then that just opened my eyes. Yeah.
Big respect.
And I won. But it opened my eyes to reading the fine print and make sure everything's written down, and I've saved all the emails, and to read everything. And so now I've started reading contracts, and there's one I haven't signed yet because I don't quite understand most of what's written on it, although they've already paid me, which I don't know, so I guess I should sign. There's that. But important for me as well, the copyright part of it as well, because my performance work happens once or twice. So it's important for me to know who owns the work and can I do it again or not, because it only lives once. And so that's the most important part of my contract, is to know whether or not they own it or I own it, whether I can do it again. And what else can I say?
What's been like a really nasty surprise at some point? Because that's great, like you say, about the draft and negotiating. And yes, Suzanne makes a very good point that when you receive a contract, it is a draft. But yeah, what are some just unexpected surprises that still stick in your mind?
I haven't really had a really bad experience. Sorry, because like I said, I've only just started signing these contracts and then reading them. But I think it just opened my eyes to also the standard rate or the suggested rate that NAVA gives. I didn't know that existed. I thought people just came up with the number, and I've been underquoting, thinking it was a certain fee. And so now when they ask me what do you think is appropriate? I'm like, well, there's this amount that NAVA suggests, and usually they automatically just agree to it, which is great. But yeah, I do feel slightly sheepish in asking for more. I've had some experiences where especially a video ad that I did recently for a pub, we can call it a hotel, where I didn't actually come to agreement. I just thought I was doing it for free and didn't actually know how long it was going to go for. And during this whole day of filming, it just went through my head. I was like, oh, I should have asked for a contract. I should have figured out like where they're going to use this footage. Do they own everything in this footage? How long can they use it for? They can edit it to whichever way they want it to. And yeah, it was just that was like a whole day of panic, which affected the way I worked the whole day as well. But then, to my surprise, I did get paid, which was great. And it was a lot of money. And I was like, great, but we have no contract. But now it means they can do whatever they want with whatever they filmed. And I don't remember, it was 8 hours of filming. So they could do anything. So that's a good lesson, I guess, that now I need to, if I do go into things like that, to have a contract and to know who owns that and what they can do with that image.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, as Suzanne was saying at the outset, contracts don't have to be in that form that we imagine a contract looks like to be a contract. It can be just, it can be verbal, that is agreed. It can be interpreted through a string of emails that you've sent going. So just to clarify, so we agreed that this is what we're doing, and then they reply. And so, there are different ways of doing this. But yeah, I'm sure we've all been in situations where you kind of, maybe it's people that you've sort of known for a while, or you've been introduced by mutual friends, and then, oh, we're just doing this, oh, but now we're doing that, oh, okay, so now and then it's kind of crept, and then it's sometimes hard to sort of trace back, oh, whoa, when did this relationship begin, and what are the things that I've done which, as individual things, would have contributed to a fee. And then, as you say, what's going to happen with the work afterwards? There's so many different areas to think of to get in there.
So there's one more thing I've started looking at as well is what happens if I don't show up, or what happens if I don't do the work. Yes. And because it's performance, and because it's one night only, anything could happen. I could be sick, I could get into an accident, and so now I've started looking at what happens if I actually can't go, and is it in the contract, and what happens then? So I've started looking at that as well, and also looking at transport as well, because I dress up and go to my gigs dressed up, and there's usually food involved and other things, I look out for or ask that transport be provided and that be included in the contract as well. So that's, I guess, changing it to suit my
This is good. More and more getting into what needs to be negotiated. Now, no doubt you've got lots and lots of questions for these guys. I've got several. But who would like to leap in with a question? And when you do leap in, Laura's got a microphone because we are recording. So it'd be great to, speak nice and clear into the mic. Right down the front here. Excellent. The mic is coming to you.
Hi, my name is Jim Fluke. I'm an architect and I'm also a sculptor. So I'm very familiar with building contracts, but I suppose getting into the sculptural space, what I've found over the last few years is that there's different deliverables, if you like. So you've got, on one extreme, you've got the venture capital extreme, where I'm going to go off and build something, pay for everything, put it in sculpture by the sea or whatever, hopefully sell it, and then someone buys it, and then I'm controlling the whole process. That's on one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum, someone might come to me and say, well, look, specifically, we're design and construct guys. We just want a concept from you, and so you do the concept, and they can build it and manufacture it. So I'm sort of looking more of my practice now to have different processes of roles and responsibilities I play, with different fee agreements, with different deliverables. And then you get into also the insurance issues attached to all of this, which is obviously, if I'm only doing the concept design, well, I shouldn't be responsible if the thing falls down because I didn't get involved in the structural engineering, for example. Or if I'm providing the product, I've got no idea where they're going to put this sculpture because it could be, on the top of a cliff and, it's got 200 degree,
Let's turn into a question.
Yeah.
A question.
So the whole question, I suppose, is one of, roles and responsibilities. So every time I do something, I don't necessarily know where this is leading. So have you gotten some advice about?
Sure.
I document it, but it tends to. I tend to find there's lots of players with lots of agendas in this. So.
Yeah. My little disclaimer is that I can't provide any one of you with legal advice in front of all of the rest of you, because it would be like you asking a doctor about something in front of everybody. But I can just give you some general information about the scenarios that you've just described there. So I think the point you touched on around various people having various interests that they want to protect or develop at any point is an important one, because sometimes as a visual artist you're not exactly sure who you're doing this work for or who you're doing this project for. So understanding what the expectations are, and preferably having that again in writing in a contract. What is your brief? What are you delivering on? And who are you delivering to? In the sort of design and commission area, I think it's useful having a contract which distinguishes between the two processes of the actual proposal around the design and then the creation of the work, the delivery of the work, things like the insurance of the work, who ultimately bears the responsibility for those things. And again, just having a really clear description around what each of the stages of that process involve and what your responsibilities are at each of those stages. So Arts Law, for example, has a template design and commission agreement which prompts you to do that. I think your other point was just around insurance and some of the things, risk really, what are your responsibilities. Something to really look out for visual artists is that a couple of things. You might have a contract which over-insures you all. So a contract, for example, by local government, I don't want to pick on them specifically because they're not the only ones who do it, but a local government contract that might say, you've got to have your own insurance for this work, and you know that they've also got insurance that possibly covers it. So you end up with a situation of being totally over-insured, and the insurers aren't going to complain because they're getting a fee from everybody that's involved. So just looking at what the contract says about insurance and getting some advice about whether or not you need to amend that and what sorts of insurance you need to get. And I think NAVA can assist with group brokered insurance as well, and you should have a look at their website about how that works. I'm not sure if that's really been very helpful, but touching on a few points. And we should maybe just give somebody else a turn.
Yes,
if
we'll
there
see
are
who
other
else has
people
a
with
question.
questions, and then come back. Yep.
Right over there on the other side, Brad. And please just wave at me any time and I'll add you to my mental list of who's next.
Hi, my name's Glen Locke. I'm a photojournalist. Just a couple of quick questions if I could. Can I just have two? Is that all right?
Ask them and let's see.
Okay, all right. So the first one, I landed up in a situation a few years ago. I won't mention the organisation that I was photographing for, but I had signed a contract. It was a 50-50 share of photos with me and the organisation, which I accepted. When I turned up to photograph, that organisation had actually signed another contract with another organisation, and they told me that my contract fell within, under the umbrella of the overarching contract. I'm wondering if that's actually something that can occur without me actually signing to that. Second question, if there's time, just about payments. A lot of the time you find magazines or whoever it is delay payments. Is that something, I presume you would just have to stipulate exactly what length of time you're required to be paid by. I'm just wondering though if there's maybe some sort of reference sheet or something along that line for different organisations.
Sure, and again, I can't provide you with specific legal advice, but if we look at the scenario of can a visual artist be bound or have to comply with an agreement that they actually haven't been involved in? So somebody else's arrangement, you've come on site and are doing work, are you automatically sort of forced to have to comply with that agreement? Just very briefly, there's a principle of what's called privity of contract, which basically means that if you aren't one of the people signing that contract, if you aren't one of the people having that initial conversation about what you're all agreeing to, you're not privy to the agreement, which means that it cannot be enforced against you, nor do you have any rights to enforce it. And it's important to understand this, because if, as a visual artist, you are relying on a third party to do or not do something to make your project a success, and you don't have an agreement with that third party, you could end up in a risky situation. So, again, in every situation, get some advice about how you can secure your rights by having a good agreement that you are privy to.
Could I just ask you in relation to that, so if there is nothing mentioned within the contract that you have signed, say my situation with the first organisation, and I wasn't aware of the overarching contract, would I still be bound by that?
I would be giving you legal advice if I answer that question. So maybe after the session we can have a chat and organise for Arts Law to actually have a look at the agreement that you signed and any sort of surrounding correspondence. Yeah.
But that certainly sounds very irritating.
Yes.
And in terms of getting paid, can't you put that in the schedule?
Oh, sorry. And to the second question around getting paid, yes, absolutely. And what a lot of artists will do is when they're initially quoting for the work that and explaining what their fee is going to be, they will include a statement around what their fee terms are. So, how, I expect this to be paid within 5 business days, 14 business days, 28 calendar days. So being specific about the number of days that you expect to receive payment. And then I think being quite vigilant about that and following it up and not being, you made that really interesting point about the feeling ashamed, and I think you did too, Shahmen, about feeling a bit sheepish about asking. If you are waiting for payment from somebody else that has not come in and you've got a clear arrangement about when they're supposed to pay you, send them an email saying, I am yet to receive payment from you. The terms that we agreed to were that you would pay me within 7 days. Please ensure that you process that payment today. And if you don't get a satisfactory response or the payment, get some legal advice, because there are things that you can do to make people who don't pay very uncomfortable, lawful things that you can do. Yeah.
Lawfully uncomfortable. We all need to get more confident at asserting our rights. It's so important. There's no more surefire way to not be paid than to not follow it up or not to set the terms. And then, of course, when you follow up, when others follow up, that I like that, legally uncomfortable. Put the uncomfortable feeling at their end. Why haven't we paid these artists? Talk to the colleague in accounts if it's a whole separate department. Why haven't we paid these artists? Let them keep having that conversation. Very, very important.
And you might make a decision to let it go, but make that decision once you've got some legal advice about what your other options are, because the lawyer might be able to suggest some strategies to you that you hadn't thought of to try and elicit that payment. So don't just assume it's too hard, it's only $200, I'm just going to let it slide, because the bulk of artists that I talk to who've made that decision without getting advice about making that decision don't necessarily feel good about it. Whereas if they're getting advice and make an informed decision, actually, on the balance of what it would cost me to chase this, given the advice I've got, I'm going to make an open decision now not to pursue that, but I'm making that decision because I know and understand what my other options are.
I think it's also, just to add to that, because in the arts, my experience of the arts is we're all interconnected in some way. You're either mates with the director or mates with the mate of the mate, or, and it's very... sometimes you're like flatmates with someone who works in the same organisation, for example. So it can get very, if you are at that stage where you're asking for payment or something like that, or your rights have been breached, it can become very uncomfortable very quickly. But I think it's important, if, like you're saying, if you've got that advice, you're able to make that clear line between, well, this is work and this is my profession, and this is also, yeah, we're mates or we're in networks. And they're two different things. So you have to kind of do that.
Also a really important point, you know, in any kind of working relationship, like you haven't turned up there to do that stuff because you're mates. You've turned up because, you know, that is your work, that is your labour, that is, and your creative intellectual property that is being exchanged. And so it's, you know, we can absolutely professionalise that while also being open and friendly and honest. You know, they aren't separate things.
And I think also friendship doesn't buy food.
No.
Correct. Shahmen.
I was just going to add, I mean, saying and adding to the being sheepish about asking about money, and I used to not be able to ask and just assume I was going to get paid and just hope that they would. But then I've now learned to ask differently. So like, what's your budget? Or, you know, how much do you have in this? And how much? And then be like, oh, is there an artist fee involved? And then make the decision to say yes or no, rather than just saying yes and then hoping to God they have money to pay me.
For me, what's become a real standard thing is, you know, in our office we often will get an email from someone saying, hi, I'm doing this thing, this project, and I'd really like to, you know, talk to an artist about, I don't know, judging it or consulting or being part of this little thing or being part of this committee. And so I always write back and go, hey, that sounds really interesting. Give me a little blurb that I can email to some people. Tell me what your fee is, whether it's hourly, whether it's, you know, for the overall project. And then often they'll come back and go, oh, there's no fee involved. And then I write back and go, well, I'm sure you can understand that, but yeah, without a fee, I'm not going to forward that to any artist. Here's some indication about what the fees might be. And also you might want to look at the others who are involved in your work, your organisation, and, you know, what and why they are paid. And then, yeah, when you've had a look, you know, feel free to send it back to me and I'll happily share it. But yeah, this kind of, you know, that sense that is a default is something that we all have to work hard to overcome. Who's got a question for Shahmen or Kelly from the artist's point of view? Oh, right up the back. Excellent. Just get the mic to you so we can hear it for the recording.
It's just more of a specific question about dangerous goods, actually. An unofficial launch of an online website to sell artworks to raise money or awareness towards a cause. If we're packaging and delivering goods, dangerous goods is not defined very clearly. We don't really quite understand what that might mean in terms of transportation, if the artist might package it. And we've been trying to look for ways within which we can sort of determine what that might mean. And it's kind of erroneous. What would you define dangerous goods in terms of arts?
Again, this falls into the box of you're asking me about something that's in writing that I don't have in front of me right now. So and again, won't advise you in front of everybody. But just to comment generally, if there is a term in an agreement that is defined, it's really important that you understand what that definition is and that makes sense for you is the first thing. Secondly, in Australia, there are a number of consumer protection laws which will deal with the way in which artists and people in general and businesses are allowed to sell or provide products to the public. So that's an important thing to remember. And just thirdly, to your point around seeing something that you're not comfortable with what it actually means. I think that is a prime example of where you get some legal advice on the whole agreement and on that definition in its context, but also potentially in a scenario like this, maybe going off and actually asking the other person, hey, your contract that you've provided has got a term in it that is not very clear to me. Can you explain what it is that you actually mean by that? Because I want to make sure that I comply with my obligations in that agreement. Nobody that you approach and tell the reason you're asking the question is because you want to make sure you don't let them down is ever going to say, oh, well, it's a stupid question, don't waste my time. They're going to want to help you to comply with that agreement. They have that agreement for a reason. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give you any sort of specific advice in front of everyone, but if you wanted to have a chat at the end about maybe getting the contract reviewed.
Yeah, look, thanks very much. It's just a bit, I guess it's more from the transport companies, and there's a kind of a clause that they have that's really quite it's not clear, but yes, standard.
It sounds like there'll be places to go to understand that there is a way that Australia Post defines dangerous goods. There's a way that airlines define dangerous goods, and so understanding which definition they're going from, which will mean asking them, getting some advice, as Suzanne says. But intriguing. I like that. Dangerous goods in the mail. Now, a question up the front, who we've already asked one. So, has anyone got a question ahead? Okay, thank you, the gentleman over there.
Hello, I'm Richard Glover, a photographer and educator. And it's about the education aspect that I have a query. As a sole trader, if I am commissioned by an organisation to present workshops, I presume by law I still maintain copyright and intellectual property in anything that I produce. Is that correct?
Legal advice question.
Sorry.
But I'm gonna pose your question. I'm going to reframe it into the hypothetical so that I can address the general concepts without providing you with legal advice. Yep. So, if you are engaged as a visual artist on a contractor basis, so you're not employed to do that work as your job, but you are engaged as a freelancer or a sole trader to come in and do certain things for people, and then you leave. Generally, the position at law is that you keep your copyright.
And intellectual property within that?
Just hold on. So that can be changed, though, by any agreement that you've got with that other person. So if you've got an agreement that basically says, normally you'd keep your copyright, but by signing this agreement, you're giving us your copyright for the project that you're delivering for us. Sorry, your second question was, and your intellectual property. So intellectual property is an umbrella term that covers all of the different sorts of, I suppose, the fruits of our intellectual efforts. So things like copyright, trademarks, designs, patents. So yes, but sometimes those terms, intellectual property and copyright, are used interchangeably. Can I suggest, if that is a scenario that you're currently dealing with and you think that you'd benefit from getting some specific advice in relation to your actual situation, again, that you contact Arts Law?
All right. Is this another specific question? Is there, if the commissioner insists on me becoming a casual employee?
I was just going to say, there is an increasing prevalence of universities doing just this, and then giving you you have to be a casual employee to give a 1-hour lecture, and it's been on the sort of back of my mind list to write to some universities, because it's a real worry.
Obviously, if you become an employee, then these things we're talking about fall into their hands. Generally, can they be recontracted separately?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm guessing when you say can they be recontracted separately, can you negotiate your contract so that your default engagement as a casual employee for an hour doesn't end up with you losing all of the copyright that you've worked for the last 7 years to develop in the workshop model that you're providing to that university? In that hypothetical scenario, yes, you can renegotiate your contract so that you carve out the copyright. The tricky thing is that universities and I guess a lot of institutions, as Esther has correctly pointed out, have got kind of template things that they use, and there's a hierarchy within those organisations that can sometimes make it quite difficult, even if the person wants to help you by making the change, to do that. So again, getting legal advice, preferably from a lawyer who can actually make a suggested amendment to the contract, so nobody's having to guess at what that would look like, and then send it back to them and say, I've just tweaked 3.2 so that it doesn't actually assign my copyright to you. Hope that's satisfactory. Please execute and send back to me. Yeah.
But we'll have to wrap it up there and go back to your question. Otherwise, it'll get too detailed and awkward for Suzanne not being able to provide specific advice. But while we're getting the mic down here, I will say that it's a practice that is really concerning, as Suzanne points out. Often the people in the who are actually having the relationship with you are not in a position to change a contract. And what we're finding, which makes the pushback really important, so that they do refer it up. But what we're finding more and more, and I've heard from 2 universities, is staff who are in the position to invite you to give that lecture are doing their own little workarounds. I've heard of, private contracts and being paid out of a lecturer's pocket who then gets the reimbursement. I've heard of being paid in book vouchers, and it's something that when you hear about those little workarounds, that is a great indication that there will be people on staff who would be very happy to, if the legal advice was sought, to keep referring it up the chain, because they're having to do this obviously so much, and that's clearly not what the intention would have been of the university authorities who set that convention in place in the first place. So rather than all those awkward workarounds, let's work together to actually change those contracts. Okay, this gentleman, and then the lady. No? Oh, okay, this gentleman.
Just another quick one. In terms of the standard contracts that you've got, are you looking at doing further ones, for example, on leasing artwork, and also maybe just design-only contracts?
We do have a loan of artwork agreement already, and we are constantly updating those agreements, and we've got a number in the middle at the moment. So the loan, you actually get paid a weekly, a monthly fee? Whatever you agree to in that contract,
yep. Yeah. So that's in the loan one. And then what about just a design fee, rather design and commissioning, where you just asked to do design work?
Again, just cautious to provide you with advice, but I would have a look at the description of what we've got. So each agreement that we have has got a pretty hefty blurb that describes what the agreement does and how it would work for you. And if you're still not sure, you could always give Arts Law a call, and we could give you some advice about it. Yeah.
And of course, you can become a member of Arts Law, which means that you would then have access to a whole range of stuff, as well as being able to purchase individual agreements. And they have got a world of stuff, as well as, of course, as you know, as a NAVA member, you've got access to, as we were saying earlier, a veritable encyclopedia of resources that are not, of course, legal contracts, but are those really detailed resources and toolkits and so on about just being an artist. Now, has anyone got any final questions, and in particular for Shahmen and for Kelly, from their point of view as artists, having had experiences that might be similar to yours? Penelope.
Hi, thanks, Esther. I don't have a question, but I do have a comment for Shahmen. You mentioned before that you... when you are negotiating fees, that you refer to the NAVA Code of Practice. I just wanted to clarify that that is a recommended minimum standard, and that you are completely within your rights to negotiate whatever fee you think you deserve. And we did, as part of our Fair Pay for Artists roundtables last year that Kelly attended, that we did talk a lot about how international artists tend to be very confident in negotiating whatever fee that they feel they deserve, and that it's really important that Australian artists also feel that they can negotiate what they think is fair for the work that they are bringing to the room.
That is so monumentally important. The lady up the front will get the mic to you so we can grab that for the recording. Hi.
I'd like to talk about if artists are asked to donate or gift something, what happens then with copyright, or what happens to the copyright, and is it gifted without a contract signed by the two parties?
Yeah, so I can answer that specifically because it's a question that's separate to anything that you're doing. Just a fundamental thing, the copyright in an artwork is separate to the physical work itself. So if somebody buys a painting of yours, they are not buying your copyright as well. They're just buying the right to own the physical work. So it's the same that if you are giving somebody a painting, a friend, here you go, here's a painting to hang on your wall, here, institution, here's a painting to hang in your foyer, what they're acquiring is the right to have the physical work, but not the copyright. You can give copyright away, but it has to be in writing. You can only give copyright away if it's in writing. And signed. So you would know if you'd given copyright away, basically, because you would have had to sign a document. But this is where the importance of reading whatever you're signing, because if at the time you think you are selling the artwork and you tell them it's the price of the work is $4,500, and they say to you, that's great, we want to pay that $4,500, here's the contract that you signed to sell it to us, and in fact that agreement includes something about the copyright, you could be divesting yourself of the copyright at the same time unintentionally. So just, again, being careful about reading stuff.
Is it only if it's a very quick question that isn't going to be disguised as legal advice? We will have one last question and then we will wrap it up. Oh, looks like you're second guessing.
So I'm just wondering, in terms of intellectual rights and moral rights, do they have to be... I think in Australia you're entitled to sell your moral rights, if I'm not mistaken, whereas you can't. So okay. So do they operate separately, your intellectual rights and your moral rights? So
your moral rights and your copyright, just to explain for people in the room, your copyright is the right, at its essence, the right that you have to make copies of your work and do other things with your work. Your moral rights are the right that you have to stop other people from doing things that would harm your reputation, and also to stop other people from using your work without crediting you. So they are separate rights, all enshrined in the Copyright Act. So I don't know if that answers your question. You cannot sell them. In Australia, you cannot waive, technically you cannot waive your moral rights.
So if you sell something that you've produced, your moral rights, no matter who it is forward sold onto, your initial moral rights always have to be respected in the reselling and reproduction of that work.
Yes, and it's not an either or. So artists sometimes contact us and say, oh, I wouldn't mind if this person had made a copy of my work without my permission, as long as they just credited me. People don't get the right to choose whether or not they get your permission or credit you. They must do both. So you have your copyright and your moral right of attribution. You have the right to say yes or no to copies and the right to be properly credited. So just so that people know sometimes.
Do you know how many times that never happens?
Clarification. Yeah, that is incredibly important.
Just quickly, does that include appropriation?
Are you saying... Yes. If what we're talking about is changes that are made to a copyright work which would be derogatory to the reputation of the artist who created that work, yes, it can come into that, yeah.
And you may be aware there's a big conversation happening in Australia at the moment about exactly that. So there are submissions due to the Copyright Modernisation Review that's due on the 4th of June. If people feel like, offering a point of view as an artist, and there's information up on the Copyright Council of Australia's website, the Copyright Agency. We're certainly working on submissions and all that stuff around, the fair use regime in the US and what happens with appropriation. I think it's something that all artists should absolutely be aware of. But this evening we've kind of we're probably all feeling like we've sort of now just scratched the surface of so much that it's incredibly important to know about. So absolutely stay connected with Arts Law and with NAVA. But I think some of the key things, and they are those simple, clear, straightforward things. Read what you're given. Don't take it as set in stone. Get advice, get legal advice, have a contract looked at, but keep having those conversations with colleagues, with artists. I'm so glad that Kelly mentioned mentors. It's so important to have those people in our lives, whether it's, like formally or informally. You're drawing on people at different career stages, drawing on their advice, because there's so many aspects of negotiation. We've all talked about the awkwardness or the confidence. We need to hear from people who have been there and done that before, and who can tell you about the time when they weren't confident, and then they can tell you about where they are now and about that shift that happened. And it only happens, by practicing, by being proud of yourself and your practice. So very best of luck with everyone. Stick around for chats, and we've got to polish off that cheese. Otherwise that I will. So first of all, thank you to Suzanne from the Arts Law Centre of Australia. Thank you. And thank you very much to Kelly and to Shahmen. Thanks so much, you guys. So much to learn from you guys. And thanks to everyone for coming along.